Hello again, and welcome to our second webinar. My name is Modestas, and I'm a product designer here at EDL, where I help businesses to design and build digital products. Besides product design, I also consider myself a design system enthusiast. And lucky for you, today's topic is all about design systems. More specifically, the definition of it and how to get started, especially if you're working in a smaller organization. All right. Do we have the presentation on the big screen? Perfect. Okay, so let's start by looking at today's agenda. So in the next 60 minutes, we'll briefly go through the definition of a design system, figure out whether it's even worth having one, map out design system's technical landscape, and figure out where to start. Finally, during the last 15 minutes, we're going to have a quick Q&A session where I'll be answering some of your questions. So don't be shy, say hello, and ask us a question at any point of this webinar so I can address them during the Q&A. The goal of this webinar is to provide you with a clear understanding of how design systems work and to recommend some practical steps you can take towards establishing your own design system. In case you already have one in your organization, you can still expect to get some tips on how to improve your existing system. All right, so what is a design system? You've probably heard a lot about them. You may have even worked on one, and yet you might still struggle to define it. Why do you think that's the case? Are we the problem here, or is it the literature that we read? When I started studying design systems, I've spent hours on reading Medium articles focusing on tooling and specific design system areas. Yet despite all of that time spent, I would still struggle to provide a simple explanation in my own words. And if anybody asked, I would either attempt to quote other experts or dive into the rabbit hole of listing individual design system components, eventually losing sight of its core meaning. So what is that core meaning I am talking about? Well, here's a way I like to put it. A design system is a set of interconnected elements that serves the design and development of a digital product or a service. The key phrase here is interconnected elements. Okay, so what elements are we talking about here? Well, here's an example of the elements I'm referring to. In the first column, we have our design elements. That includes color and typography styles, libraries for our components, and our design files in Figma. In the middle, we have our front-end resources, as well as a set of tools that we can use to make our front-end development faster and more efficient. Lastly, in the last column, we have our code base and the products that our design system is meant to support. So, the key takeaway here is that these elements do not make a system on their own. What really makes it a system is how these elements are connected to each other. All right, so we covered what defines a design system. Let's figure out what doesn't qualify as a design system then. Well, first in the list, we have UI kits. While UI kit is a great resource for us UI designers, it enables us to work faster. It's not really a system on its own, however. Same goes for front-end frameworks and component libraries. Both are valuable resources that enable developers to build UI faster. However, it's important to note that they are just resources and not a standalone systems. Lastly, we have a reference site. So reference site is a central hub that showcases our components, UI patterns, documentation, code examples, guidelines, and much more. You can think of it as a storefront of your design system. So A good example is material.io or polaris.shopify. However, like all of these elements, reference side is just a part of a design system and not a standalone system. So the key concept that we need to understand here, that these elements do not make it a system individually. However, it doesn't mean that they cannot be a part of one. All right, now that we know what are design systems, let's discuss whether it's even worth having one. All right, so during the preparation of this webinar, I came across some interesting stats. Let's start with the first column. So the data science team at Figma wanted to find out just how much time could be saved when teams utilize design systems. So they found out that using a design system can make design up to 34% faster. To put this into perspective, if a project originally took 10 days to complete, the same amount of work could be done in 6.5 days with a design system. Sparkbox is a US-based design agency helping big organizations to design and build web experiences. Their team has conducted a small study to find out whether design systems improve developer efficiency. Sparkbox discovered that development can be up to 47% faster with design systems. During this study, Sparkbox also found out that 7 out of 8 developers who were using design system produced code that was more visually consistent with the design. And last one is from Alibaba Travels. Excuse me. Well, so Alibaba Travels is an Iranian-based company that offers a platform to find and book travel destinations. So not the Alibaba you probably thought of, but it's still worth noting that their design system team claims that the design to development handoff became 50% faster thanks to their system. And if you're still not convinced about the value of design system, here's a quote from our friends at Ally, specifically even their front-end developer, who is sharing his thoughts on how their design system has helped him to speed up his work. Okay, so here's what we learned so far. Design systems improves consistency, makes design and development faster, and even increases user satisfaction. Does that mean that every company should go and build their own design system? Well, the short answer is yes. But there are quite a few considerations we need to make before we go and build something on our own. The most important consideration, in my opinion, is the scope. In other words, how complex our design system needs to be in order to provide value to our organization. It's important to hit that sweet spot so that we're able to meet our technical and organizational requirements while still being able to maintain it efficiently. We're going to talk more about that in the next segment. So, technical landscape of design systems. Here, I'm going to walk you through some of the most common design systems implementations. We'll start with the most basic setup and slowly increase the complexity to reflect our growing organization needs. By the end of it, you should have a clearer understanding what level of complexity suits your organization best. Small note here before we start. All of the scenarios we are going to cover are hypothetical. I'm going to mention some popular tools and libraries for the sake of this presentation, but please note that every tool and resource you decide to use in your own system needs to be carefully evaluated, so you are absolutely sure that it fits your technical and organizational needs. Okay, so let's start with our most basic setup. Perfectly suitable for small teams who are working on their first digital product. Before we break this down, I would like to explain the difference between solid and dotted lines. So, solid lines means that our elements can be automatically synced. For example, whenever we make changes to the code in our web app repository, those changes can be deployed and automatically propagated to our web app. The same cannot be said about translating design changes to code. And that's the reason we have dotted lines here. So dotted lines in this case indicate that our elements can only be synced through manual efforts. For instance, translating design to code is a manual process. Although we have tools and techniques such as Figma's dev mode and, for example, a hot potato method, coordination between designer and developer still remains a manual task. So now that you know the difference between solid and dotted lines, let's zoom out a bit and cover what we have here, okay? So on the left side, we have our Figma file storing design for our marketing side and our web application. In the middle, we have web builder to build and publish our site, and a Git repository where we store code to our React application. Finally, on the right side, we have our products our system needs to support. We're mostly going to focus on our web application since it requires the most effort to build and maintain. So how do we build a nice front-end experience for our web app while keeping the entire process cost-effective? Well, considering that we're starting from scratch, we need something that will be able to jumpstart our design and front-end development. Having that in mind, a good way to start would be finding a front-end library that will serve the needs of our application. In our case, we're going to use Material UI. So Material UI is a great front-end resource. It has an amazing track record of supporting their components and keeping them up to date. And the best part about it is that we can also use their Figma kit in addition to their React library. Now, let's get back to our system. So now that we have Material UI kit for Figma and a library for React components, how do we integrate those in our current setup? Well, we would start by moving the UI kit to our Figma workspace, publish it as a library, and finally, customize the colors, typography, and other styling properties to reflect our brand. This allows us to use an already defined boilerplate for style definitions, make global changes fast, and most importantly, have access to pre-designed UI components. Now that we covered the design part, let's move to the front end. So the plan here is to hook up Material UI library as a dependency to our code base. This means that whenever the team working behind MUI makes and deploys changes to their package managed library, our components are going to be updated as well. In other words, Material UI team will maintain it for us. Now, before we go and start building the front end using components from Material UI, we need to spend some time on customization. So the styling is aligned with the changes we've previously made to our UI kit. This will require us to update the global CSS file provided by Material UI and apply necessary styling overrides to the components we are going to use. All right, we finally did it. We have officially launched our design system version 1.0. This setup allows us to be fast and nimble while still ensuring consistency throughout our front-end experience. And the best part is that we've built a foundation that allows us to scale and work our way up towards more mature design system. So, what's next? So, to keep it simple, we started off with a single Material UI file, where we stored our styles, variables, and components all in one place. As our product grew and became more complex, we started running into some issues. So one of the issues could be that we have too big of a style and variable options in our library. Too many components to the extent that it becomes difficult to browse and find what you need. And finally, we might end up dealing with poor performance. So how do we solve these problems? Let's get back to our design system and see what we can do here. First improvement we could make is to decouple components and variables in our UI kit by splitting them into separate Figma libraries. At this point, we can simply publish our variables and styles library and call it a day. But to further improve our setup, we can do a quick audit and identify the components that we have been using so far. That way we can get rid of unnecessary components and move the rest to a dedicated Figma library. Well, great. Our Figma setup has become slimmer, more modular, and more organized. This allows us, the UI designers, to work more efficiently and faster. But this doesn't mean that we should throw away Material UI Kit. We can still keep it in our workspace and use it as a reference when working on a future components. All right, great job. We managed to improve our Figma setup and make our designers' life easier. But let's not stop here. Say we want to throw in a mobile application in the mix. At this point, we really need to reevaluate our technical requirements. So let's get back to the slide for a bit. So far, we've been using Material UI, package managed library for our React components, UI kit as our main Figma resource. And along the way, we split our UI kit into two separate libraries. So these resources allowed us to support the development of our React app. But now that we have a mobile application to deal with, we are running into some compatibility issues. You see, Material UI was built for React applications, which means we cannot use the same components in our React Native project. So let's find a resource we can actually use to build our mobile applications. The library of our choice is called React Native Paper. The great thing about this library is that it supports material design, which is exactly what we need at this point. So, since we're working with React Native, we can use this library for both iOS and Android application. Okay, let's get back to our design system. Let's zoom in a little and see what we're dealing with here. So to build and maintain iOS and Android apps, we are going to need two additional Git repositories. To supply our apps with pre-made UI components, we are going to use React Native Paper as a dependency to our iOS and Android repositories. Now that we have taken care of our technical setup, let's see how things should evolve on the design end. Due to the differences in screen sizes, interaction, and user behaviors, we should split our mobile and web components into two separate libraries. By splitting components for each platform, we can tailor the design to the specific needs and constraints of each, providing a more optimized UX. We also allow our designers to turn on the library that they need. So for example, if I'm working under my web app file, I don't really need to use mobile components. So in that case, I'll just go into my asset panel and turn this library off so it doesn't cluster my asset panel with mobile components. All right, so yet another milestone was reached. Our design system can now support the development of two additional applications. Now we can finally start translating our design into code. As our product and organization grows, so does the number of front-end components we need to deal with. It becomes increasingly harder to keep track of your component inventory. And the bigger our inventory is, the more important documentation becomes. So are there any tools we can use to help ourselves out? Well, this could be a good time to look into something like Storybook. Storybook allow us to organize, document, and test components in isolation, which is incredibly useful for teams working on a large-scale projects due to its documentation capabilities. Furthermore, the design add-on for Storybook enables us to embed Figma files alongside our code-based components in Storybook. Meanwhile, the Storybook plugin for Figma allows us to embed stories alongside our design components in Figma. So this makes it much easier to cross-reference our design and code components and reduce visual inconsistencies. Before we continue, I just want to thank for the people that stayed this far. We are getting closer to an end of this segment. We only have a couple of improvements left. So, design tokens. To put it simply, design tokens allow us to capture our design decisions. You can think of them as data entities containing design values. They can be used as variables, but we shouldn't think of them as just variables. The reason why we shouldn't think of them as just variables is because they are platform agnostic and can be moved, transformed, and adapted across different platforms. This cannot be said about variables. So let's try to break down a common design token setup. So usually design tokens consist of 3 layers. So in the first layer we have for our global tokens. So global tokens usually store raw design values. So in this case, it's a hex code for our purple. Alias tokens, on the other hand, are referencing global tokens, meaning that if we change purple 500, changes will be propagated to this token as well. So this allows us to make and scale changes faster. This is especially useful if we have a nice token setup for our typography. So imagine if you had to change your global typeface for maybe 3 different products, right? This task would be so much easier with the help of design tokens. Finally, we have component specific layer. And here we're again referencing the alias token we have that goes before it. So in this case, surface accent strong. So global tokens establish a consistent base for design elements and provides building blocks for our system to grow, while alias and component-specific tokens provide a clear contextual meaning to design variables, making it easier for designers and developers to understand the purpose of each token. The best part about design token is that we can apply custom theming to them, which means that if we want, we can easily toggle from dark and light mode. Let me show you a quick demo of how this would be done in Figma. So all we need to do here is to select the entire section, go to Appearance, and toggle our mode from there. It's worth noting that this requires quite a bit of preparation, uh, but it's doable with the right approach. So, in short, if you want to learn more about design tokens, we'll be releasing a podcast episode where we'll be talking about it more in depth. So if you're curious about design tokens, feel free to have a listen whenever it drops. Now, let's carry on and get back to our system and see how can we utilize tokens with our current setup. So, to properly represent our design token setup in Figma, we are going to split our styles and variables into two separate libraries. One of the libraries would be the purpose of one of the first library would be to store our global tokens, and the other library would be to would be for storing our alias tokens and styles. So if we throw Token Studio in the mix, we can export design tokens from Figma. This allows us to publish it to some external JSON file. From there, we can translate JSON into desired code syntax, and all we need to use is some sort of a style transformer like style dictionary. Once we have this pipeline up and running, we can distribute our design tokens directly to our code base. So this pipeline brings us one more step closer to having design and development in sync. It also requires quite a bit of maintenance. A setup like that only makes sense if we're dealing with multiple products across multiple platforms, since design tokens are platform agnostic. So another good use case for this would be if we're dealing with white labeled software or something like we've explored before, light and dark modes. So this brings me to the question of how complex our system needs to be. Well, unfortunately, there is no short answer here. It really depends on your technical and organizational requirements. The important thing is that before we make any improvements to our system, we should always ask ourselves these three questions. So the first question would be, are we going to be able to maintain this? Okay. If so, the second question can be, how much it'll cost to maintain it? Finally, we need to ask ourselves, how is this going to improve our workflow? And then it's up to you to decide whether it's worth all this extra cost and maintenance. So, in short, the slimmer, the more lightweight your system is, the easier it is to use and maintain. It's also easier to document. So make sure to make improvements unless there is uh, you're absolutely sure that your organization can benefit from it. Okay, so we're almost done here. We're currently we're in our last segment now, and here we're going to summarize what we've learned so far. So, where to start, right? A good way to start would be to understand, to map out the technical landscape. So it's something that we've been doing all along this webinar. It's a good way to start because it'll help you to better understand your needs and technical or organizational requirements. Now, once you have that in place, you can start defining your scope. So before we can define the scope, of course, we need to know how complex our design system needs to be. And the good thing is that we've already found out that in the first step. So we can adjust the scope accordingly and then move on to a third step. So once we're locked in terms of the scope, we can start auditing our existing UI. So this step is all about you going through your existing product and noting down the components you're currently using. So specifying the number of occurrences for each component will help you will provide you with a good insight on how to prioritize your inventory. Now, if you're starting from scratch, this is not it's not a step that you should be doing necessarily. This is something that you can obviously skip because there's nothing to audit. But you can start doing that after you've implemented your setup and your product became a little bit more mature. Finally, we should start with the implementation process. And once we are done with the implementation and launched our version 1.0, then we can look into documentation. Now, you've probably noticed that this is the first time I'm actually mentioning documentation. Well, besides storybook bit in the last segment. And there is a good reason why the documentation is placed at the bottom of this list. So a lot of people consider documentation as the main part of the design system. And I would definitely agree with this statement, but only if we're talking about larger organizations. And the reason for that is it requires a lot of ongoing resources to maintain it. So if you work in a small company, chances are that, well, in the beginning, you might be undergoing a lot of UX tweaks, redesign. That could be a redesign or a rebrand, and this will require your system to adapt as well. That being said, the documentation would have to be kept up to date too. So I always think that it's better to wait a little. You can wait till your organization or product becomes slightly more mature and things become a little bit more stable before you start prioritizing documentation. Now, that doesn't mean we cannot write documentation about specific component usage. This could be also like do's or don'ts for color usage, so our designers know exactly how to apply colors. It's just not something that you should prioritize with your initial 1.0 version of a design system, unless you're obviously supplying an enterprise level company with a design system. In that case, documentation is something that you should be prioritizing first. But in general, when we work in smaller companies, I think it's always better to wait till things slow down and our product organization becomes slightly more mature. All right. We've been a little bit ahead of the schedule. So now we have time for a quick Q&A session. And let's see if there are any questions to answer here.
See here. We have Frederick that thinks that design tokens are such a powerful addition. Not a question, but adding to We spoke about that.
All right.
Um,
I agree with Frederick, by the way.
We've got a question here. First, Stephanie says, "Thank you, Modestas, for this webinar. And also, do you believe that all companies need a design system regardless of size? And when is the right time to start?"
Well, I think we kind of covered that in the beginning of our presentation. And so, yes, in short, the answer is yes, but it really depends on our technical landscape, right? What are we working on? What products are we trying to support with that system? So it's important to evaluate your needs there, and it doesn't make sense for all the companies just go out there and build material UI from scratch. So I think I just want to find that slide. Yeah, okay. Well, I missed that already. I'll carry on with my answer. The point is that we need to carefully evaluate the scope of our system before we decide to implement it. So yes, it makes sense for majority of the companies, unless you are one-man army. But the real question here is how complex it has to be. Hopefully that answered Stephanie's question.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see if we have any more questions from our audience here.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing.
I think we should see it as a good thing. Hopefully, you have answered most of people's questions during this webinar.
Yeah. One last thing I wanted to note, and this is specifically about this slide right here. So I presented it as some sort of a linear process, but again, this really depends on your current state. So this might not look the same if you were to tweak your existing or build a system on top of something, whereas compared to starting from scratch, right? There will be a difference, right? If we already have a product in the market, the third step, like audit, is very relevant, right? We need to go through our product, identify the most reusable components, and so we have a clear side of our inventory. But if we are starting from scratch, there's really nothing to audit there, right? We should postpone that step later in the process. So just to remind you to take it the grain of salt. It all depends on your current situation.
Really good addition there. We've got one more question from Oscar here that wonders, what are the best practices for effectively using and implementing design systems in product development?
Depends the size of the product, right? Depends how many products, right? I would always recommend, if we're talking about small companies, I will always recommend find good design and front-end resources to start with. That'll make the entire process faster, right? So if we pick a good front-end library that maybe comes along with a nice UI kit, that'll already gives us a nice jump start, and we can go ahead and start building. Of course, we need to integrate that in our system, and eventually we'll be able to use those components to build our product. So I would always recommend starting from with something that is already out there.
Mm.
And starting small, right? Don't be overly ambitious, right? We're just trying to build something relatively quick to support our design and development efforts, but we're not trying to build a spaceship with our 1.0 version 1.0.
Okay. Nice. Let's see if we will get any further questions. Mm, but I think that's a good sign. People probably not at home wondering too much after this webinar.
Well, to be fair, I've kind of speed ran the entire landscape segment, so might have been that we've overloaded them information. Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. And also, if people have any like questions after this webinar that maybe come up in their minds.
Oh yeah, about that. If you have any questions, if a question comes to your mind after this webinar, feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, and I'll try to do my best answering all of your questions.
And maybe we can also mention that this webinar will be also posted on LinkedIn, so people can always look back whenever
That's
they
right.
want.
That's right. That's another important thing forgot to mention. Yes.
So we got Frederick here that thanks for the webinar. Yeah.
Thank you for attending, Frederick.
I think that if we won't get any more questions right now, then maybe we should thank you very much, Modestas. And Søren also says, good webinar, thanks for sharing. Very much appreciated.
All right. So we're just so we're clear, we're wrapping this up, or we should wait for a couple of more minutes.
We can have a couple of last minutes here. So if anybody got a question, then just feel free to drop it in the comments section.
Is there anything our audience should be aware of? Upcoming webinars or?
There are upcoming webinars. Right now, we don't have anything scheduled, but there will be.
So stay tuned.
Thank you.
We'll keep you up to date on our LinkedIn.
We also have Oscar that thanks you very much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for attending, Oscar. All right. All right. Well, we're wrapping it up then. Thanks to everyone who had time to attend this webinar. It's been an amazing opportunity for me to share some knowledge with you guys, and hopefully we'll meet sometime in the future in our upcoming webinars. So once again, thank you for attending, and have a beautiful day, everybody.